4:17 a.m. The glass box hung over the harbor like an accusation. Inside, light carved the room into planes of cold steel and black marble, and Omega moved with the precision of a ritual. She dressed in absence rather than fabric, a suit cut to erase softness, a silver clasp at her throat that fit like a promise. At 04:17 exactly, she uncapped a vial from a biometric locker and let 2 crystalline drops slide under her tongue. The taste was iron and peppermint, and the heat settled like a small engine into her chest. The vial was not medicine. It reset a trace. It made signatures slippery as oil on glass. It was another kind of armor for someone who trafficked in secrets and holds. The penthouse smelled of ozone and old leather, and the harbor wind made a paper-thin counterpoint against the glazing. Laptop screens glowed like distant constellations. She rehearsed a sentence in her head and then folded it into a square, a single line written in the slant she used when she wanted to be unreadable. For the world, she was an asset manager named Mara Cole, with a fund called Omega Capital, efficient, cold, and precise. For the men who tracked rumors, she was a cipher who could liquefy reputations and draw maps in losses and gains. Tonight, her target was not an index or a board seat. Tonight, she intended to ping the oldest network in the city. She would slip a note into the palm of the Alpha and watch a constellation shift. If you've made it this far, then this story has found you. Before we continue, take a second to support the channel and help this BL universe grow. Subscribe to the channel, that way you never miss the next chapters. Like the video, it tells the algorithm this content deserves to reach more people. Comment below, I want the next part, or which character intrigued you the most? Your support makes all the difference. Now take a deep breath and let's continue this story together. The rooftop elevator exhaled them into the same artificial night. The club had velvet that felt like secret, and a stairwell with brass that remembered hands. The Mafia Alpha, Lucian Vetro, sat in the heart of it, a low man with the posture of a predator at rest and a presence that made the air lean. His face was a study in deliberate relief points, a scar at the jaw like a comet mark. Around him rotated senior figures and satellites that fed information and fed ghosts of loyalty. He ordered drinks like a final accounting. Lucian was not a man animated by impulse. He was a ledger. His decisions were entries that closed books and opened ledgers. But tonight his ledger met an odd variable, an unknown deposit with immediate consequences. When Omega slid into a booth opposite him, her note already folded into a business card, the room inhaled. The ritual of greeting was minimal. Lucian did not extend his hand. He recognized power in a silence and rewarded it with a narrow nod. Her routine had been a ritual of erasure and insertion. Her camouflage would be a single line on paper and the right place to leave it. The scene smelled of cologne and frying oil and the metallic edge of a crowd. She moved like a closing argument, voice practiced low. "Mr. Vetro," she said, and the syllables landed like coins. He let her speak. The note was a seed folded into the place where fingers exchanged bills. When Lucian read 3 words, his pupils tightened, and, for the smallest fraction of time, he looked like a man seeing a door open in a wall he had always trusted. Around them, the troop of secondary players shifted. There was Enzo, Lucian's fixer, who had a laugh that tasted like cash. There was Paolo, bodyguard and former naval petty officer, who watched with slow, efficient cruelty. There was Naya, the broker who handled offshore shells and made them sound like poetry. There was Hana Casa, a head of security who had worked for the intelligence unit and whose fingers remembered how to unpick locks. There was Julian, Omega's right hand, who monitored markets from a shabby office 2 blocks away and who never smiled. There was Director Voss of the exchange and a woman called Isla, a corporate attorney who could convert a confession into a clause. Each had a place and a promise of action. The note read, "There is a proxy laundering through a hedge that buys into Volta shipping. They move sovereigns at night.
Stop the vessel on Tuesday and the rest follows. Lucian folded the paper clean and placed it under his glass as if it were a small sacrament. The movement was simple, but it recalibrated the room. Omega had given him a weapon that was not money. It was a lever. He accepted it like a man who knew the cost of accepting. In a moment, negotiation that had been a private performance for two became a theater of threats. A hand reached for a bottle, and Paolo cleared his throat. "Who is leaking to you?" he asked, the words meant to make a wound. Omega smiled, without teeth. "Someone who prefers not to see money pass through unmarked hands." Lucian's laugh was a soft thing. "And your price?" he asked. Her reply was not immediate. She let silence sit like a witness, then placed the phrase that reset alliances. "Half the line for me and the rest for my fund." The words were currency and challenge. Lucian leaned forward. He liked the cut of someone who asked for shares. He liked the clear appetite. "And if I say no?" Enzo's pistol under his jacket was a tension held close. Then the micro-incident happened. A waiter grazed the table and a glass clinked, a tiny metallic sound. The sound was
A metronome, and the metronome coincided with something small and sharp being slipped into Lucian's drink. Paola, the server, who smelled of lemon and grease, moved away with a tray and a smile that did not reach her eyes. Omega saw the slip as if it had been in slow motion, the silver glint, the darting wrist, the bead of liquid separating. Her hand closed on the vial in her pocket, and she felt the instrument of her morning ritual warm against her palm. Instinct had trained her into levels of contingency. She did something that had cost her a childhood of discipline. She lifted her own glass, poured a small splash of her drink into his, and said to Lucian, "Try the second." He did, and the taste of the second glass carried a different note, whiskey and copper and a faint trace of ozone that did not belong. He tasted and blanked. His eyes narrowed like slits. Conversation turned into an exchange of veiled accusations in quick, bright chess moves. Dialogue stretched longer and doubled. "You slipped me a note to bait me into an operation," Lucian said. "You gave me a target and now you change the rules." "I gave you a way to claim a route," Omega answered. "You can refuse and watch it move and suffer the losses of surprise. Or you can accept and own the damage. Or you can accept and take me on as insurance." "Insurance in your hand is different from insurance in mine," Lucian said. Enzo interjected with a laugh that was a stone. "You want him to take orders from him." "I want him to take numbers," Omega replied. "We speak the same language of assets." The room felt like a ledger rewriting itself. Sounds tightened into pointed syllables, the hum of the club receding to a background of breathing like a machine. The smell of spilled spirits and leather mingled with a metallic undertone of a plan unfolding. Omega's backstory came between breaths like an explanation hidden in an appendix. She had been born Mara Cole in a coastal town where ships left with names and returned with none. Her father had a small fishing boat and a ledger of debts people did not like to visit. At 12, she watched his ledger be redrawn by men who paid in favors and in fear. She left home the night she signed her first falsified document as an act of repayment and then never looked back. She studied finance with a hunger that learned to parse smell as easily as numbers. She learned algorithms and learned how to make a court document look like rain. She lost a brother to a default that had nothing to do with markets and everything to do with a political bad faith. That loss taught her that the ledger did not always lie. She built a fund that could short reputations the way others shorted stock. She had a protocol for everything and a solace in precision. Her student life was a sequence of nights where the taste of metal in her mouth became the baseline for decisions. She had a surgical calm because she had been on the edge of ruin and had chosen arithmetic over grief. That past lived in a fine line along her throat where a scar might have been but was not. It was a scar in accounting. It explained why she trusted vials and not vows. After the club exchange came the appearance of a new player. At dawn, a man called Caspian Rowe stepped into the light like a calculation given human skin. Caspian was introduced to her by Nia on a gray afternoon in a place where the ocean sounded like a slow clock. He had the quiet of a contained storm. He owned a consortium that traded in blackout windows where controls were thin and compliance weaker. He was not an alpha, he was a bridge. Caspian's first demonstration of power was physical and precise. He asked for the note and then held it in the palm of his hand and read a line that had been folded 3 ways into a knife. He looked at Omega and then at Lucian and said simply, "You have all been moving around the wrong ledger." He ordered a delivery to a port, and the port complied before anyone could file a protest. The boat was stopped by men in uniforms whose permits came from a department that would later deny involvement. Caspian's imposition made Lucian raise an eyebrow and offered Omega a sense of the scale she had touched. Fortress and planning followed. Omega conceded that she could not execute the operation herself. She accepted Lucian's fortress as the place to plan. The fortress was a high building on an industrial pier with concrete that smelled of rust and a command room full of screens that turned the world into a grid. They moved across it like old generals. Hanakasa walked them through security blueprints with a fingertip on a scanned plan that displayed cameras and blind spots. "We will run a wet ledger check," she said, clinical. "We will close the ports that accept the shell transfers. We will force the back door to bloom into the open, and then we will trace the money to the shell." Julian gathered data from Omega's trading algos and set up a synthetic pressure. Director Voss of the exchange received a clandestine call and agreed to a temporary halt known as a trading pause when anomalies met a certain threshold. They rehearsed language for the public release in case the market smelled blood. Each room smelled different. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. The plan room like old sweat and disinfectant. Omega explained an operation in a voice that was both tender and precise. "We will short a subset so that we can buy back at a lower mid. We will use a proxy corporation to hide the initial stake. We will route through a shell that will mirror a forensic trail that points to a different name." Lucian asked about collateral damage, and she replied with the clinical answer of someone who had weighed lives and outcomes. "Collateral will be reputational and financial. We will not close ports where people sleep unless they work for syndicates. There will be noise, there will be lawsuits, they will be short-lived." The backstory expanded in a way that felt like a map being drawn on demand. Omega told them about the first short she had engineered that had toppled a local shipping magnate and how she had watched his empire vaporize like perfume. She told them about a time at university when a professor told her that markets were an apolitical force, and she had replied that markets were bodies with memories. These accounts were small and clinical paragraphs that loaded the plan with motive and with stakes. In the fortress, the group named tasks. Enzo would handle external pressure, his men positioned at known black market ports. Paulo would manage physical interception of a cargo manifest. Nia would set up a proxy, a company called Gray Ledger, where trade records would be disguised. Hana would ensure safe rooms and false routes. Julian would coordinate algorithmic sweeps at the exchange. The names were given tasks and given reasons to be afraid or proud. The attack on the market came next. Omega and Lucian synchronized a strike that was half art and half forensic process. They placed a coordinated series of short positions that would create a shadow that the market would read as panic. They used a shell corporation to hide the trade called Gray Ledger and a dry ledger of accounts in jurisdictions that rarely answered subpoenas. The technical procedure was a concise sequence of instructions that read like a surgical checklist. Step 1. Seed a panic in commodity futures for port logistics by executing a visible sell in a high-volume window. Step 2. Trigger exchange circuit breakers by matching volumes of an adjacent sector to simulate a liquidity swoon. Step 3. Once prices hit the engineered low, deploy anonymous buys across fragmented accounts to reclaim positions. It was elegant and legal on paper, but on the edge of breach when mirrored with physical disruption. They executed. The exchange reacted the way Omega had predicted. Prices dipped, and the press smelled blood.
Traders shouted in open chat rooms, the market microphones took the scent, and Director Voss enacted a halt that would lock the price for 5 minutes while regulators queried anomalies. In those 5 minutes, they moved assets and rewired the order flow. The numbers spiked in a pattern that at first seemed accidental and then read like handwriting. The effect was immediate. Counterpositions had to liquidate or face margin calls. Several funds folded. The shipping shares tumbled. The proxy that had been moving sovereign transfers found itself naked. During the financial attack, there was a scene of exchange among players that contained 8 rapid dialogues over the space of a few breathless minutes. "Are we live?" Julian asked. "Live," Omega answered. "Hedge is in place?" Lucian asked. "2-tier buy and 1 off book," Julian said. "Enzo, you have interdiction?" "Ports are shadowed," Enzo replied. "Paulo, your team?" "We have manifest and a back door." "Hana, surveillance?" "All routes feed to 1 node for 60 minutes." "Nia, shell confirmed?" Gray Ledger cleared 3 jurists and a trustee. "If regulators sniff collusion, we all burn," Lucian said. "Then make sure they sniff the wrong body," Omega answered. The voices were efficient and made the room into a machine of intent. The attack produced the expected drop, and the public narrative held enough ambiguity to protect them from immediate exposure. This was the clinical side of violence, where markets as architecture could be pried open and portions taken. The procedure explanation required a small technical aside to make it credible. Their method relied on a backdoor in the exchange matching engine that allowed synthetic trades through a vendor client. They used time-sliced orders to appear like retail volume and aggregated positions through a series of nested accounts known as spiders. The spidering created a mirror of liquidity, which, when pulled, created a vacuum the others could not arbitrage in time. This note was less glamorous but crucial to the operation. It was an algorithmic mimicry that exploited regulatory blind spots and took advantage of reporting latencies under high-frequency trade windows. The explanation sat like a skeleton in a closet. It was clinical and compact and required technical minds who could read the code of markets like verses. The operation had consequences not only financial but biological. A suppressed chemical that had been introduced in Lucian's drink at the beginning unfurled effects hours later. He felt it as a heat that crawled up from the throat and settled at the base of cognition. His suppressants failed in the small hours like a machine losing lubrication. He tasted metal and saw a wall of cold color. Omega approached with lethargic care, and the two collided in a moment that blurred command and possession. Their tension swelled into an exchange that was part necessity and part desire. Lucian, who had always been territorial in a way that made allies feel like acquisitions, found himself losing control and finding the taste of that loss oddly clarifying. Omega's clinical touch became an intimate act. "Stop fighting the way the world wants to control you," she said. He struggled, both physically and with the architecture of his life that insisted on domination. "You are not an asset to be acquired," he answered. She laughed once, a short sound that tasted like cedar smoke. "Neither are you a dominion, you are a vector." The crisis made them both vulnerable, and in the vulnerability they recognized leverage. The first contact had the cruelty of a truce becoming a pledge. That personal clash was followed by recuperation and then hunt. They realized the poisoning had traced to a ring of couriers tied to a figure called Cade Vell, an old rival who ran a shell from an island jurisdiction. The hunt required interrogation scenes that were gritty. Omega and Lucian handled interrogations in turns that alternated between soft threats and procedural pressure. They placed a mid-level broker in a fluorescent room with a fan and a list of consequences that read like legal options. "Tell me where the manifest was forged," Lucian said. "You have reputation to lose." "And you have bodies to lose," the broker replied. The dialogue expanded into a full-scale theater of veiled admissions. "We worked for Cade," the broker confessed after an exchange of 12 questions. "He funneled through a chain of 3 shells and used a trustee in a microstate. He took payments in bearer bonds." The discovery revealed a deeper plan. Cade had been creating a web of insurance policies and default triggers that, if activated, would force Omega Capital into a corner and leave Lucian with a liability that would drain his coffers. Cade was a chess opponent who had hollowed out pieces and then set out to hollow out kings. They found that Cade planned to use the gala 3 nights hence as a stage to flip a vote in a shipping consortium and cement his control over a crucial artery. The gala was the classic target: marble, chandeliers, and a tightly guarded guest list that doubled as a list of account numbers. In preparation, they made a map of the gala and assigned roles. It required a precise infiltration. Lucian would attend as public enemy turned reformed patron. Omega would enter as a benefactor with a smile and the presence of someone who could make hospital wings feel like an investment. Enzo would be the shadow near the loading docks, and Paulo would manage egress. Hana would oversee security swaps and ensure that cameras recorded the things they wanted permanently and erased the things they needed to forget. The gala night smelled of perfume, citrus, and expensive spice. Lights flattened faces into masks, and music made conversation into secret code. They executed a plan that combined seduction, technical sabotage, and sheer physical force in a sequence of events that built to the climax. Omega engaged Cade in a conversation that began with pleasantries and moved into the territory of threats masquerading as compliments. "Your reach is impressive," she said. "It is. Yours is invisible." They traded thin smiles and thinner promises. Cade smirked and invited Omega to taste a champagne that had a small grain of time release in its effervescence. She laughed and declined, and then slipped a conversation about shipping routes into his ear like a prayer. Lucian moved through the room and planted a device in a chandelier that would interrupt the gala's private network and allow Julian's algorithm a 5-minute window to expose Cade's offshore gains.
Filings to the press. The device was small and mechanical and smelled faintly of copper and oil. It was a process, explained in a sentence that read like a procedure. Insert a probe into the event VLAN, create a noise pattern to mask the probe, then burst the data outward to 2 independent feeds that would publish under the guise of a whistleblower endpoint. The device did what it was supposed to do. The network hiccuped and then fed a dossier to 3 outlets. In the hall, a fight became physical. Paulo intercepted 2 of Cade's men near the service door, and a scuffle splintered into a clean fight that the room watched as an unfortunate accident. Dialogues during the gala were dense. "Who is she?" Cade demanded at one point. "Someone who collects debts," Lucian said. "And what does she want?" Cade asked. "What everyone wants," Omega replied, "to be left with less to fear." The press feeds lit up with leaked documents that showed Cade's chain of shells and included images of invoices and asset transfers that could not be spun by lawyers into neat apologias. The exposure was quick and brutal. Cade found himself with no refuge, and his investors called for emergency meetings. His consortium began to fracture, and the mafia world that had protected him turned its face. In the end, he tried to flee through a service corridor and found the corridor blocked by men with no mercy. His arrest was public the next morning, and it had the cleansing, competitive smell of a ledger balanced. There were 3 moments of heightened tension in the story that required reflection and weight. The first was the club poisoning, where Omega made the choice to test a reaction and in doing so exposed both Lucian and herself to risk. The second was the market strike, where legal edges were blurred and the team watched their own creation threaten to consume them. The third was the gala, where personal and institutional stakes collided and exposed wounds that would not be covered with invoices. Each of these moments lasted as long as a heartbeat expanded into a night and needed space to breathe, which they got in fragments of memory, choice, and consequence. In the club, Omega felt her childhood ledger write itself across the table again. During the market strike, she remembered her brother counting change in the back of a boat. At the gala, she relived a moment when she had first learned the price of silence. After the fallout, when Cade was taken and assets rerouted, the new balance unfolded in measured scenes. Lucian's men took possession of a set of shipping lanes and a small fleet that had been his ambition for years. Omega's fund acquired distressed assets and converted them into a portfolio that insulated their new alliance. The market jumped and then settled with new averages that favored them. The legal inquiries were persistent but inconclusive at first.
They had crafted plausible deniability like armor. Yet there remained traces. Lucian woke some nights with a metallic taste and a pressure at his neck that he could not name. Omega found herself both relieved and empty in ways that mathematical victory could not measure. The epilogue arrived in 3 marked intervals. 1 month later, the city had rearranged itself. Lucian walked the pier with an air of measured victory, and the harbor smelled of diesel and salt. He and Omega sat in a small office with windows that looked out on containers like tombstones. "You could have taken the money and left," he said. "And you could have taken my life and left," she replied. They had both taken something else. Their alliance had morphed into a partnership that tasted of cedar and short nights. The rumor mill turned, and some hedge funds repositioned to account for a new power. The note that had started everything lay pressed in a ledger in Omega's desk, ink faded but potent. 3 months later, the law wrote notices and subpoenas that matched the pattern they had expected and planned for. Media narratives tried to brand them as conspirators and as unlikely lovers, a phrase they both tolerated and ignored. Omega spent many hours in the archive room watching filings and sipping coffee that tasted of burnt trust. Lucian began to attend meetings in suits that fit him like treaties. Their symbiosis showed signs of a slow calcification into structure that might be called governance. 6 months later, the new reality had settled. Omega Capital and Lucian Vetro Enterprises announced a formal alliance in a press release that read like an acquiescence and an assertion at once. They framed it as a strategic merger in which risk was hedged and social capital converted into a supply chain advantage. The press photo showed them distant and composed. Behind the photo lay a signature on a document that moved assets and canceled old debts. There remained a mark on Lucian's palm that looked like the faint imprint of a paper square, and Omega kept the note in a safe with her vials. They had gained territory and had lost easier versions of themselves. The taste of victory was clinical and warm, and had across it a residue they could not fully scrub off. The narrative closed on an image that was both emblem and wound. In a room of glass and steel, Omega placed the folded note back into her pocket and found it fit like a small compass. Lucian stood by the window with the city reflected in his eyes, and for once their reflections matched. They had won assets and lost innocence. They had turned enemies into partners and crime into corporate strategy. The ledger balanced, and some new lines appeared that would be written into statute or whispered about in backrooms for years. A mark remained on Lucian, a small circle of lighter skin at his neck that he earned in a fight nobody would list.
As part of the minutes. It was a brand that meant different things to different people. For Omega, it was a pledge of territory. For Lucian, it was a reminder that control is a negotiation that often costs what you thought you owned. If you were in that room, what would you have done? Comment either "I choose the alliance" or "I choose the revenge," and say why. Join the conversation and tell us whose ledger you would tally in the end. If you want more stories about how power mutates into shared dominion, subscribe so you do not miss the next piece of this series. The city kept its lights on, and their deal kept the tides moving. They had made a marriage that read like a merger and smelled like cedar and conquest. The ledger had been redrawn, and the note that started it all proved that a single folded line of ink could still rearrange the world.